I'm Tracy Dooley. I'm a partner at Avestria Ventures, and this is our latest session in our webinar series featuring Avation Medical. And we're so pleased today to be able to welcome Jill Schiaparelli, the CEO and co-founder of Avation, as well as Dr. Colin Goudelocke, who's a urologist at Ochsner Health. And so a little bit as an introduction about us, for those of you who might not know us that well. We are a San Francisco-based venture firm. We focus exclusively in women's health investment. And we came to this through, sort of 20 and 30 years, effectively, of industry experience within the healthcare sector, with hedge funds, VC-backed startups, as well as Novartis, Applied Biosystems, and Thermo Fisher. And she holds an MBA from Harvard and did her undergrad at Yale. And I've had a similar sort of timing perspective. My background complements Linda's. I started in engineering and went to medical school, but we met in 2010 at Novartis and evaluating early stage companies together. And I've also worked with the Gates Foundation and the Novartis Digital Accelerator Lab. And we're joined by our colleagues, Ava Epker and Michelle Branch, who are also longstanding connections of ours. And the reason why we invest in women's health is because there's a huge missed opportunity here. We also believe that from our times as strategics, being able to invest early in seed and Series A companies enables them to strategically build towards a good exit to those strategics. And so we invest across the numerous therapeutic indications that impact women exclusively, disproportionately, or differently. That includes reproductive health and menopause, also urology, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative disease, autoimmunity, cardiovascular disease, and oncology. And we also have a broad subset of subsectors that we invest in as well across devices, diagnostics, digital health, tools, services, and some therapeutics. And the reason behind this is that the why now is that because historically we've had a lot of data based on men who were included in clinical trials. Women weren't allowed to participate in clinical trials until 1993. And it wasn't until 2015 that the NIH required studies to include female mice, female cell lines, female tissues in their basic science research. And so we haven't had a lot of great data to draw really relevant insights and assess outcomes in women until the past decades. And so this has had impact on outcomes, clinically in many different areas, unfortunately. We see that in cardiovascular disease, women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed. In Alzheimer's and autoimmunity, the vast majority of the patients are women. However, we are not really looking at insights to the personalized degree that we could. And in oncology, again, women have different outcomes, different presentations. And if we don't really have the right robust data, we can't generate the appropriate insights and we can't provide optimized care, which I think all of us believe that we deserve. And unfortunately, the funding sector is really not catching up with this and has not recognized the value of this. So we really only see a small piece of NIH funding or public or private R&D funding going towards women's health when women are over 50% of the population. And I would also venture to say that everybody is born. So there's a vested interest in that as well. And so we're trying to close the gap, particularly for early stage opportunities here. Within the $4 trillion healthcare industry, which is growing massively, we've been fortunate that, in 2021, funding from venture cracked the $1 billion barrier, but there's still much more headroom to grow. There's a lot of opportunity out there, and there are fantastic, experienced entrepreneurs and clinicians who are working towards creating very important solutions to problems with huge amounts of unmet need. So with that, I would really love to introduce you to Jill Schiaparelli, the CEO and co-founder of Avation Medical, as well as Dr. Colin Goudelocke, who we have here with us today. And we're so fortunate to have them on with us. So Jill Schiaparelli has a vision to make neuromodulation more accessible to people who suffer from chronic conditions such as overactive bladder. Jill brings more than 20 years of experience in the healthcare industry and has really specialized in bringing cutting-edge medical technologies to markets to help the lives of patients. Her background is incredibly impressive. She's been in leadership with major healthcare companies such as Johnson & Johnson and Baxter. She helped sell Apotec, a high-growth company in the UK, to Baxter, Axogen, where she assisted their uplist to NASDAQ, and Intilomed. And she also serves as a mentor at the Neurotechnology Innovations Translator to launch and grow companies in the neuromodulation space. And she's got an incredible background. She has an MBA in Finance and Business Management from the Stern School of Business at NYU, and a BS in Finance and International Management from the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. And she's also joined by Dr. Colin Goudelocke. He is at Ochsner. He is a board certified and fellowship trained urologist and female pelvic medicine and reconstructive surgery specialist. His research focuses include urinary incontinence and voiding dysfunction, as well as various forms of neuromodulation. At Ochsner, he is the director of the Ochsner Pelvic Health Center of Excellence, which is fantastic. And he's also a Surgical Review Corporation accredited Surgeon of Excellence in Continence Care for Women at Ochsner Baptist. And he earned his medical degree from the Louisiana State University School of Medicine in New Orleans and completed internship and residency at Louisiana State University Health Sciences Center in Shreveport, Louisiana. He also has a fellowship in female urology from the Medical University of South Carolina, and he continued his faculty there, and then went on to practice in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he was a founding member of the University of Tennessee Department of Urology, as well as the overactive bladder clinic, which was among one of the nation's first clinics. We are so fortunate to have Jill and Dr. Goudelocke here today to talk about the innovations that they're working on for, overactive bladder, which is, a condition that is extremely prevalent, but, not talked about very much. And really their work in elevating the conversation and bringing this into the limelight has been so important. So I'm thrilled to bring them to you today. And with that, I will turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Tracy. And thank you to Avestria for having both of us today. We always love talking about Avation Medical and the Vivali system. And I've seen you present those slides before on the, seemingly lack of focus on female health. And it's a gut punch every time we see it. But it really reminds us that there's a lot of areas in medicine that just need a common sense approach. And that's what we're trying to do at Avation Medical. If you'd like to go to the next slide. As Tracy mentioned, our vision, well, I should back up. Avation Medical is an exciting startup company focused on wearable neuromodulation. We're based in Columbus, Ohio, and we're really trying to think about ways to make the promise of neuromodulation, which some people call bioelectric medicine, more accessible to physicians and patients through non-invasive, digitally controlled systems. And back to common sense, if you think about it, neuromodulation, which is putting electricity in the body to control a function or improve a function, has been around for a long time, but it has such great potential. And I think where we are now in 2024, there are at least 300 startup companies working on forms of wearable neuromodulation. And the reason is it has such immense potential and power across a variety of chronic conditions. And that's why when we founded Avation Medical, we wanted to create a platform to take the requirement of a surgical implant in the brain or the spine, which brings with it a lot of risks, to the forefront. And as we'll talk about for OAB, this does disproportionately affect women. So I'll get into a little more detail, but our first product in this area is the Vivali system, which we believe is going to disrupt the enormous OAB and urge urinary incontinence treatment market. We are currently the only FDA-cleared closed-loop wearable neuromodulation system that provides continuous sensing and automatic output adjustment, and we surround that with a digital support wraparound. The upshot here, again, common sense, is we're eliminating the need for drugs, surgery, and permanent implants. So let's start by talking about what is OAB. And Tracy, if you could advance, that would be great. As Tracy mentioned, this is an incredibly prevalent condition. 1 in 6 adults, 42 million adults in the United States have symptoms of overactive bladder. Overactive bladder is a chronic and progressive syndrome. Nothing, including our product, cures it. The typical symptoms are incontinence, urinary incontinence, urgency, meaning you really got to go, frequency, you go a lot, and having your nighttime sleep disrupted, waking up having to urinate. So there are a lot of consequences of this. You might think, oh, it's just an annoyance. Somebody with overactive bladder can void 20 to 30 times a day. If you have a healthy bladder, you void 6 to 8 times a day, and it kind of fits in with your lifestyle. But think about a teacher in third grade. She's got a classroom, he or she has a classroom of 9 and 10-year-olds, and more than once an hour has to call down to the principal's office to have somebody watch his or her class while she goes to the bathroom or he goes to the bathroom. And the thing about it is, this is every day. It's not like just every other day or every third day. It's every single day. And sometimes holding a job can be a really challenging thing when you have a condition like this. Also, think about the impact of your social life. People who have this syndrome, and as it progresses, tend to become more reclusive. They may only initially go to places they're familiar with, where they know where the bathrooms are. And then over time, some of them may not leave their house at all. So we see high rates of anxiety and depression and associated use of those drugs. We see reduced productivity. And in this population, you also see some other types of comorbidities, such as urinary tract infections, falls, and associated fractures. So it really is a life-altering condition to have. And you might think, well, there's probably a bunch of really good therapies out there. There are a lot of therapies. The question is, are they right for patients? They are all effective in the sense that they went through a clinical trial and they met criteria of FDA. But the problem is, from the patient perspective, they have major drawbacks. And that's likely why we see more than 90% of patients dropping out of the care pathway, typically within 2 years. Patients are literally telling us, as industry and as healthcare providers, I would rather wear a diaper or take my chances than have your therapies. And so let's talk about why that is. There's really three major categories of therapy: drugs, and they come in different types, but they all have side effects. And when you think about it, for a chronic condition, you have those side effects every day. It's not like an antibiotic that you take for 4 or 5 days and you feel a little nauseous. This is every day. You have dry mouth, dry nasal tissues, constipation, dry vaginal tissue. And perhaps most concerning, for patients over 50, there is a documentation of an increased risk of dementia. And some of these drugs have inconsistent efficacy. They work very well for some patients and very poorly for others. Then there's neurotoxin. Yes, you can have Botox injected into your bladder. It's an invasive procedure in that a cystoscope is required, and you go in and you actually inject directly into the bladder wall. And that needs to be repeated every 6 months. And there's also a slightly elevated risk of urinary retention. And if you have that, you will then need to self-catheterize, which is not very desirable for patients. And finally, surgery. There have been products on the market for more than 20 years for sacral nerve stimulation. It's a permanent implant in your back. It causes scarring, and there are risks of complications like any surgery. It's a big deal surgery. More recently, there are surgical implants that can be placed in your ankle. It is less invasive, but still, most patients would prefer not to have any surgery at all. So when we saw this, we said there's a need to rethink therapy. At the same time, physicians are seeking new options. Dr. Goudelocke has often told me they can't treat all the patients that are interested in being seen by a specialist. And so the idea is, if we can bring in a technology to market that's accessible to more patients, that does not require the advanced surgical training that physicians like Dr. Goudelocke has, as an industry, we have the ability to make the product more accessible to more patients because it's accessible to more physicians. So this is really the common sense problem that Avation is trying to solve. let me give you some statistics on it. And Tracy, if you could go to the next slide. These numbers are prevalence numbers. So over the last 20 to 25 years, if you look and say there's about 42 million people with OAB, we know that after about 4 to 5 years, about 26 million of them have gone to a doctor and said, I would like some help. And typically, that patient is then routed to a successive series of treatments that we call first, second, and third line. And for those of you that follow urology and OAB guidelines carefully, you will know that within the last couple weeks, some new guidelines are coming out, and it will be interesting to see how this changes. But you'll still appreciate there's still typically a flow. First line are things like don't drink quite as much fluid, avoid the Slurpee right before bed, avoid caffeine, avoid alcohol, which are known bladder irritants. And there are some behavioral tactics, things like voiding diaries, timed voiding. There's things you can do to get better control. And most people are suggested to do this, and most people try it. It typically doesn't get, massive symptom improvement, though it does have some benefit. And then maybe the patient will say to the physician, what else do you have? And then typically there are a number of medications that will be prescribed. And typically a patient will cycle through 3 to 5 of those either because of efficacy or side effect profile. And if you look at what's happening across the bottom, we go from 42 million down to roughly 8 million people in the fullness of time have tried medications. And then when you get to third line, and Tracy, if you could just hit enter, this is where neuromodulation sits currently, and it is really the most effective. But look at how few people have gotten it. The Medtronic talks about in the 25 years they've had InterStim on the market, they've only implanted about 400,000. And if you think about that, what are you doing for the other 41.5 million? So when we created the Vivali system, Tracy, could you click enter? We wanted to come up with something that was non-invasive and could be used earlier in the care pathway and throughout the care pathway. And this is where our commitment to accessibility is coming in. So let me tell you a little bit about Vivali. As I mentioned, we're the first FDA-cleared closed loop continuous sensing wearable. So what does closed loop mean? It's really an advance in neuromodulation. And what we are doing is we are calibrating the electrical output to the patient's EMG signal. That's muscle contraction. And we're able to do that by targeting the tibial nerve, which is kind of a great nerve to choose for this because it's called a mixed nerve. It has sensory components and motor components. So we use the sensory components to get the electricity to the sacral plexus so we can calm the nerves that surround the bladder muscle. But we use the EMG signal to confirm that the electricity has reached that nerve, which is a really important thing in neuromodulation. Anybody can put electricity in the body, but if it doesn't get to the target, you've accomplished nothing at best, and at worst, you may have harmed some other important thing in the body. So by having closed loop and calibrating, we're able to deliver electricity very efficiently and at a consistent therapeutic effect that is personalized for each patient. Another interesting thing, and this is really new thinking in neuromodulation, our system has an automatic adjustment because we're continuously sensing about 20 times a second. That signal is able to adjust if it detects that we're not activating EMG. And you might wonder, well, why is that happening? Every time a patient moves, or sometimes based on environmental conditions like humidity, the electricity demand from your body changes. And so in real time, we're able to make that adjustment, which means if the patient wants, they can move around while they're undergoing therapy, and it maintains consistent activation. Another important aspect of being patient-friendly and accessible is it has to be convenient. Not only is this easy for a physician to prescribe in a typical office visit, they can monitor the patient remotely if they choose to do so. The patient then does therapy in their home, and it's very convenient. We're 30 minutes, and in our clinical trials, we did that just 1 or 3 times a week. So it's not a big burden on the patient. They simply put the garment on, and then they turn therapy on through an app on their phone. Dr. Goudelocke will talk more about our clinical efficacy, but we've really had a very terrific outcome. We find that we are typically exceeding the efficacy that has been reported in the literature for most drugs, and we're rivaling invasive neuromodulation without any of the risks of surgery. And by the way, in our clinical studies, we've had zero device-related adverse events. And in terms of our digital health platform, we think about it in three aspects. One is the patient app, which provides condition support and an electronic bladder diary to track symptoms. We provide a personalization app and progress tracking portal that the physician in his or her office can use. And then we have all of the data go up to a cloud database. We believe that there's a lot more to learn in neuromodulation. We will be tracking all of this data and working with an advisory board of physicians to begin to publish out of this. But we believe in very short order, we will have efficacy and compliance data on several thousand patients. And just briefly, last slide before I turn it over to Dr. Goudelocke. We now have in 2024, 13 peer-reviewed publications and posters, including most recently in January, we had a publication on which Dr. Goudelocke was the lead author in the prestigious Urology journal. And you can see it on the upper right. We were the cover model, which was a little bit of a nice marketing feature for us. So all in all, we really are committed to bringing new innovation to patients with a patient-friendly wearable solution that can be used safely and effectively in the home and can help physicians retain patients in their practice and offer another option. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Goudelocke, who has been so instrumental in helping us shape and think about the product and has been a great partner for us in terms of our clinical studies. He's challenged us when we needed to be challenged, but he's also encouraged us and let us know that this is something patients really need. So Dr. Goudelocke, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you to talk about the clinician perspective. Tracy, you can start.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Jill, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today about my experience in this space and my experience with this system. And really to piggyback off what Jill was talking about, certainly probably could not have said anything better in terms of the necessity of such a device in the space and what it offers. What I'd like to offer today is a little bit of sort of the clinical perspective, the boots on the ground, if you will. What does this disease state mean to someone like me? Most of my practice is devoted to what we call female urology, and kind of focusing on that area. And frankly, overactive bladder in particular plays a huge role. I could say the majority of patients that I see on a daily basis deal with some form of incontinence. And so it's a major part of pelvic health. So today, I just want to spend a few minutes kind of talking about from a provider's perspective, from a researcher's perspective. I lost my earphones. Everybody, Jill, you can hear me okay? Sorry about that. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about a provider's perspective and a researcher's perspective, and what this means to me and to my practice. So to echo what Jill said, why overactive bladder, why pelvic health in general, but why overactive bladder specifically? That this has a huge impact. We think about 34% of older women will experience the symptoms of overactive bladder. About 12% of women will have daily incontinence. So to echo what Jill is saying, this is not something that's happening every now and then. For most of the patients I'm seeing, this is happening every single day. And even for those patients, it's happening once or twice a week. I mean, if you think about it, this is a sudden, compelling urgency to urinate, that you're rushing to get to the bathroom and not make it. So even if it happens just once or twice a week, think about how you're worried about that all of the time and how it affects what you're doing and affects where you can go. And, these were women who are not going to see friends anymore. They're not going to dinner. They're not going to sporting events. They're not playing tennis. They're not going to religious services. And this really has an impact on their lives, socially, psychologically, physically, sexually. It just really affects the entirety of someone's life. And then Jill mentioned, the comorbidities with things like falls. When I'm talking particularly to an older woman and asking her, how many times do you urinate during the daytime? How many times do you urinate at night? Because what we find is these women who are getting up 2 and 3 and 4 times at night in the dark, when they're confused, that's when women have falls. And so we don't normally think about overactive bladder as a life-threatening disease, but the risk of falls in someone who's getting up multiple times at night, the risk of hip fracture, and in some patient populations, hip fracture has almost a 50% morbidity associated with it. That's a life-threatening aspect of overactive bladder and something that we take very seriously. So, what about the adequacy of our current therapies? Well, the first problem is Jill talked about very accurately that 90% of people actually drop out of therapy. But I think it's also important to remember that the majority of women who report these symptoms of overactive bladder, of frequent urination, of urgent urination, of leaking on the way to the bathroom, only about 35 to 40% of those women actually receive any kind of treatment. So while there may be a 90% dropout of treatment options because of their inadequacy, unfortunately, the majority of women aren't even given the opportunity to drop out because they're never really offered therapy. I think some of that is our failings as how we take care of these patients as providers, but I think some of it is a little bit of the limitations of the therapies that we have. Jill made another good point that I want to kind of emphasize, and she talked about we simply don't have enough providers to provide our current therapies. So I specialize in this area. I do most of my research in this area. All of those therapies that Jill talked about and talked about some of their limitations, I provide all those therapies. I write overactive bladder prescriptions multiple times per day. I inject patients with Botox multiple times per day. In fact, right before this meeting, I was injecting a patient with Botox. I put in a sacral neuromodulators multiple times per week. I have 2 of those patients on tomorrow. So I use these therapies. I believe in these therapies. But it's really important to know that particularly with the therapies like botulinum toxin injection and various forms of implantable neuromodulation, it generally takes a specialist like me to implant these things. She was accurate when she talked about 42 million patients with overactive bladder. And one of the reasons why so few patients go on to third-line therapies is, so when I go to one of our specialty society meetings, my subspecialty society for female urologists, there might be 300 or 400 or 500 people at that meeting. That's the 300 or 400 or 500 urologists in this country that are really interested in treating overactive bladder, that are injecting the Botox, that are implanting the neuromodulators. I'm better at medicine than I am at math, but I know that if you divide 42 million by 400 or 500, you still end up with a very big number. And so there just are not enough providers like me to provide this therapy. So when we start to talk about a home-based, closed-loop neuromodulation system, what I start to think of is that it allows providers who are not me, it allows patients to see a primary care provider and potentially be able to receive a prescription for a device like this, and without necessarily having to see a subspecialist in the future. And I think for me, that's what opens up the access, and that's what's really excited about it. So let me spend just a few minutes kind of talking about patient access. So certainly I think she very accurately talked about some of the limitations of Botox and neuromodulation. And again, these are limitations. These are therapies that I believe in, therapies that I use on a daily basis, but there are definitely aspects of these more invasive therapies that create a barrier between patients and treatment. Even when you look at other things, sort of comparable therapy that is still invasive, but doesn't necessarily require a trip to the operating room, what's often called percutaneous tibial neuromodulation, which is sort of the type of tibial neuromodulation that I've lived with for the last 12 years or so, the type of tibial neuromodulation I used before the Vivali device. Even that has its barriers. So for those who might not be familiar, posterior or percutaneous tibial neuromodulation which is in some ways sort of a predecessor to this, involved a patient coming into the office initially for a weekly visit, having me put a needle into just behind the kind of the posterior part of the ankle and stimulating that nerve for about 30 minutes. And it's in terms of invasiveness, it's relatively minimally invasive, right? We're putting essentially an acupuncture needle, but it still provides a lot of barriers to treatment. So the patient has to be able to come into the office on a weekly basis, initially weekly, and then eventually on average every 2 or 3 weeks. And so I serve a relatively large area. There are not a lot of specialists in my region that do what I do. And so we oftentimes have patients who are driving hours in to see us. So you can imagine these are not therapies that are realistic for someone who might need to drive hours to see someone who does what we do. And so it's just not a therapeutic option for those patients. So when I first encountered this device, one of the things that was most exciting to me was thinking about, hey, I can take all of these posterior tibial neuromodulation patients, which honestly, because it's less invasive, tended to be older, tended to be sicker, tended to have more other issues going on. And I thought, that's great. These are perfect examples of patients, and my thought is that's who we would enroll in these clinical trials. And in the clinical trials that we did, it worked really well for those patients, and they were actually quite satisfied. What I didn't think of though was the younger woman, the 25-year-old, who potentially had the same symptoms as the 85-year-old, and was just as bothered, if not more bothered, than the 85-year-old. And maybe didn't want to take a medication every day for the rest of their lives. Because one of the things to remember, Jill made the point about this is not a curable disease. And unfortunately, none of the therapies that we're talking about are cures for this disease. So when we think about therapy, we really have to think about not what are we going to do for the next 6 weeks or the next 6 months or the next 6 years. What therapy is going to be appropriate for the patient for the rest of their lives? And so for a 25-year-old woman staring at the idea of even having to take a medication every day for the rest of her life, even if she had relatively moderate side effects or no side effects at all, just the prospect of taking a medication for someone that young was really quite daunting. And so, in fact, the very first patient that I enrolled in the second Bi-Valley clinical trial, it was the first trial I participated in. The very first patient I enrolled was a 25-year-old woman. That's exactly what we talked about when we started to talk about the options that were on the table. Hey, we can try medications. If those don't work, we could talk about Botox. We can talk about neuromodulation. And you could just see the disappointment on her face, and this idea that, not only have you told me that I have a lifelong incurable disease, but now you tell me I'm going to have to take a pill every day for the rest of my life. And it dawned on me, I said, well, we have this clinical trial. Would you be interested? And you could just see her face light up with the idea that there's something that I can do that's not taking a pill, that's not putting something inside of me. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that this could be an option not just for sort of the older, more infirmed patient that I thought, but the younger and very active patient that doesn't want necessarily the burden of the therapies that we have. And I've always said, as a healthcare provider, the more tools that I have in my toolbox, the better I'm able to provide this care. And this is really a very, very important tool. So much so that I told Jill there was a time between her second clinical trial, but it was my first with Bi-Valley, but a time between the second clinical trial and the third clinical trial where there was a gap, and there was a time when I couldn't enroll additional patients. And I told her, in many ways, I felt like I was practicing with one arm tied behind my back, because patients would come in and the other options that I had weren't quite appropriate for that patient, or it just wasn't something that they felt was appropriate for them. And it just felt nice to give them something that was fundamentally different. The last thing I'd like to talk about for just a couple of minutes to emphasize is she mentioned the closed loop aspect of that. And that's really important in the area of neuromodulation. And I do a lot of treatment and a lot of research in the overall area of neuromodulation, including other types of implantable tibial neuromodulation, and sort of the next iteration of sacral neuromodulation. And I can just tell you that sort of the goal of that therapy is the closed loop that she's talking about. And what do we mean by closed loop? Well, the idea is that you're going to provide some treatment, but you'd like some feedback on that treatment so you know how to adjust it, and you'd like for that feedback to be in real time. When you think about an insulin pump doesn't just keep giving insulin. It delivers the insulin, and then what is the body's response to that insulin? And then it adjusts the next dose of insulin to that. We see the same in deep brain stimulation. So, in so many other areas of other types of therapy and even other types of neuromodulation, a closed loop system is just sort of assumed, and it wouldn't make sense in any other way. And so in other forms of neuromodulation, it's already been recognized. And there's some other trials that I've been involved in looking at other types of neuromodulation in closed loop, where we're trying to do that. We're trying to adjust our stimulation of the target nerve based on the feedback of the body. And what I think is really exciting about this to me is they're already there, right? So I'm working with other companies to try to develop closed loop systems. And meanwhile, Jill and her group come to me and say, we've got a closed loop system we'd like for you to test. And that was really exciting. Because what that does for me, if you think about how I deliver tibial neuromodulation today, is the patient has to come into my office, I have to place this needle, and then I have to adjust that stimulation to try to figure out, number one, am I stimulating the target nerve? Am I stimulating the target nerve enough? Or am I stimulating the target nerve too much, right? So we talk about safety. Am I stimulating it too much? And efficacy. Am I stimulating it enough? And right now for a patient, that requires them coming in and seeing their physician or nurse practitioner, physician's assistant. And that's a barrier to care. What I think is really interesting and exciting about this system, the reason it's able to be a home-based system is because they've built that in, right? So not only do they know that they're stimulating the appropriate nerve, so we know that we can achieve the efficacy that we've seen in these clinical trials, but we also know that we're stimulating the nerve not too much. We're not going to harm patient, which is very safe. But we're able to do that at home instead of having the patient have to come in to see me. And that's really what allows for this home-based therapy. And just with the final minute or so that I have, the last thing I want to highlight is the platform that surrounds this system, because that's actually really important. One of the things that I really preach when we talk about any therapy for overactive bladder is it's not about the therapy alone. It's not about the therapy in isolation. It's about the therapy plus all of those other things that we know have an impact on a patient's system. So words we use like bladder training and behavioral modification and those sorts of things. And what's really innovative about this system and what has me excited about it is the platform around is itself a really good support structure. And the way that those things act synergistically with the therapy itself. We know that any overactive bladder therapy plus behavioral therapy is always more effective than the intervention alone. And we see this in this system as well. And that's so important, because if we just treat these therapies as sort of isolated, one and done type of interventions, we're never going to get the kind of efficacy that we really can see. And their platform is really outstanding. It collects a lot of data. It's a lot of feedback for patients. And the other thing is there's huge room for growth in terms of, pushing patient education, potentially, I don't want to put too much pressure on Jill for the future, but, integrating things like AI interaction with patients in terms of educating them about their disease state and making recommendations. It's a platform that has nothing but growth potential, and it's one of the aspects of that is because patients are using this therapy on a weekly basis. or multiple times per week, it gives us an opportunity to interact with that patient and really sort of treat the entire patient, not just this one little target nerve. So that's really all I wanted to say today. I'm going to be quiet and let everyone ask their questions of Jill and myself. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today about something I'm genuinely passionate about, and honestly, a device and a system that I think is going to be such an important tool in the toolbox of people like me that frankly deal with this disease on a daily basis. So thank you very much.
Incredible. Dr. Goudelocke, I mean, your passion comes through loud and clear, but both of you, obviously, Jill and Dr. Goudelocke. And thank you really for getting this on the market for, everybody who has overactive bladder, right? I think this is an incredible game changer, and we really value, your advocacy and your persistence and, your willingness to kind of move this forward, right, to get it on the market. So we have some questions, and so we'll transition in the Q&A portion. For those of you who are watching, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, but we'll kick off with some of the questions that have come up right now. So Jill, we'll maybe start with you on this one. Okay. So where can and how can women access the Vivali system? And then as a corollary to that, is this covered insurance? And if not, when do you expect reimbursement?
Not surprisingly, those are like the two most common questions I get. If you go to if you go to the next slide, if you reach out to us at Avation, customer care at Avation, there's a email or a phone number. We can try to connect you with a physician in your area. We are in what we're calling a limited launch right now. And insurers are starting to come on board. We have coverage from some commercial payers as well as from the VA. We're in the process of working with CMS, which provides Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. So it's coming online. We have a very good economic value proposition. So we're finding a lot of commercial payers are really intrigued. But for anyone on the phone who's an entrepreneur, I'm just going to say we've got it wrong in the U.S. healthcare system. We unfortunately require companies with innovative technologies to get FDA clearance first before they can start to work on reimbursement. And that's just wrong. And even with some of the breakthrough designations for medical devices, it's still not sufficient. And, the unfortunate part of it is most people do need reimbursement for medical devices. And, we're doing our best. It's coming online, but I will also say we have deliberately priced the Vivali system to be a good economic value versus everything else on the market, including pharmaceuticals. And that's part of our commitment to accessibility.
That's enormously valuable, right? And I mean, yeah, thinking about those 300 to 500 colleagues of yours, Dr. Goudelocke, at your society meeting, trying to treat this slew of 42 million patients, right? It's a tsunami that, I think this is really positioned well to provide relief for folks who can have access to that.
Economics are a really interesting thing, and I didn't touch on this. Somebody with overactive bladder spends huge amounts of money out of pocket. Most of the treatments that Dr. Goudelocke and I talked about carry with them a $20,000 copay. I'm sorry, a 20% copay, which for a procedure like sacral nerve, which can be $30,000 to $40,000, that's still $6,000 to $8,000. In addition, incontinence management, things like diapers or nighttime urinary collection systems are not at all covered by an insurance. Average person with moderate incontinence spends on the order of $125 to $300 a month out of their own pocket, completely unreimbursed, just to manage their incontinence. So this is also economically harmful to patients in addition to all the other things we talked about.
And imagining that over, for that 25-year-old
forever,
right? Over her lifespan, that is a significant, it's a significant tax, right, on somebody's financial viability and ability to do things in their life as well. So yeah, thank you. I mean, it really shows how thoughtful you were in putting all of this together, right? And really thinking about the economic benefit to patients, obviously the clinical benefit to folks. And I think, this is, it's really incredible to see. How long do you have to wear the device to see results? And can you wear it multiple times? How does that work?
So we, in our clinical trials, we aim to have it be very minimal. It's 30-minute sessions. And in our clinical trials, we looked at once a week and 3 times a week. And then after 12 weeks, we reduced to just twice a month, and we maintained efficacy in most of the patients. The practical reality is, though, the system is completely personalizable based on the severity of the symptoms. So Dr. Goudelocke may have a patient and he may say, start 3 times a week, and then we can try to ratchet back. Let's just say if they ratchet back and the symptoms return, then you go back to 3 times a week, or maybe somebody wants to do it 4 times a week. We do, for safety purposes, have a lockout, a 23.5 hour lockout. But there's no reason why you can't do it more in the home, and there's no additional cost. So that was another intentional design feature.
And that's incredible, right? For a 12-week course, right? Instead of having to take medication every day of your life, right? I mean, and being able to get results, right? And then being able to sort of titrate up and down through the course of your journey, with the
Dr.
disease.
Goudelocke, can you share how often does a sacral nerve modulator work?
So that's yeah, that kind of opens up this sort of huge area of I would say interest and controversy in neuromodulation. You know, so to answer your question, sacral neuromodulation is essentially right now in 99% of instances is continuously administered. So we just stimulate the nerve constantly. Again, that idea of the closed loop and is not there in sacral neuromodulation right now. So we just stimulate, stimulate, stimulate. And there's some like me who really believe that that's probably overstimulation. There are a couple of clinical trials looking right now at sort of intermittent stimulation. And then some of the newer devices that are being looked at are intermittent as well. So traditionally in tibial neuromodulation, we stimulate on a weekly basis and then sort of less often than that. And that's a matter of practicality. It's, how infrequently can we get someone in to do this therapy because it's cumbersome for the patient and it's expensive. Jill made a good point that you could stimulate yourself 4 times a week and it costs you the same as if you stimulate yourself once every 2 weeks. That's not true when you're having someone come in and pay a copay every single time that they have a tibial neuromodulation done in the office the way we've traditionally done it, and of course the payer coverage for that would probably also start to fall off. And we don't know if there's sort of an ideal number of times to stimulate. And I would venture to say that if there is an ideal number of times that per week or even per month that you would want to do tibial stimulation, it would almost certainly vary from patient to patient. And what I think is really exciting about this is it gives patients the opportunity to titrate their therapy according to that need. And let's be honest, some of that may be a physiologic or neurophysiologic need, but some of that may be a psychologic need as well. We know one of the aspects of overactive bladder is the way that patients feel about their symptoms and their sense of control. And I can't imagine what's going to give a patient a greater sense of control than being able to say, you know what, if my symptoms are really bad today, all I need to do is go and put the device, the garment on my foot, and then I can walk around for 30 minutes and have a stimulation if my symptoms are a little bit worse today. And in some of my conversations with other people that are working in this area, that thought about sort of patient autonomy and patient control and giving her the ability to treat her symptoms when she wants to is really powerful. And we think it may end up having a huge impact on the efficacy of therapy. And Jill and her group are not the only people that are thinking this way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's such an incredible point because I think, when you think about the sophistication of a lot of women, right, who have been looking for solutions, and women, tend to be the CEOs of their family's healthcare decisions and their own healthcare decisions, right? I think a lot of that really, they're very educated consumers, right, and they want to understand, what they can do. I mean, and a lot of us, right, we take allergy medications, right, or Tylenol or something like that, and we dose it appropriately to our needs. And so being able to transition something like this into again, more control for the patient is incredible. We do have a question asking about, for the patients enrolled in the trials, how effective was the device and does it vary based
Uh,
upon age?
Sure. So yeah, I could start, and I'm sure Dr. Goudelocke could fill that in. We've done two safety and efficacy studies. The first was stimulation only, and the second was stimulation with the wraparound digital. Um, and what was interesting, and there's a number of ways that you report outcomes for overactive bladder. I'm just going to use the sort of summary one, which we call responder rate. We had a 70% responder rate in stimulation only, and in the active arm of our sham trial, which Dr. Goudelocke recently presented at the SUFU conference, we had an 84% responder rate. And for those of you unfamiliar with how you measure these, that basically means it's a percentage improvement within at least one symptom. And to give you a sense of comparison, the sacral nerve modulators, and these are unfair because these were not head-to-head studies, but typically you talk about sacral modulation, the implant having about a 76 to a 90% responder rate, and we were at 70 to 84. So we were in that range. As to the question on age, we didn't have a specific endpoint. It was not powered to look at age, but we did have to report that to CMS. We saw slightly lower in a much older population, and we define that, I hope no one's offended, as over 65 because we were looking at Medicare group, but it was still in that range. It just fell off by a couple points, and that was sustained out to a year. And Dr. Goudelocke, please correct me if I got any of that technically wrong. I was just trying to be expedient in my answer.
No, not at all. And certainly the numbers are accurate. The one thing I would caution is that it's a little bit of a challenge to compare the data in the free OAB trial, and then which has been published, in the reduced trial, the data of which have been presented in abstract form and will be published fairly soon. It's a little bit of a difficulty because the FDA had asked Avation to use a responder rate that was calculated a little bit differently than has traditionally been presented in at least in the sacral neuromodulation. So it is hard. It's always hard to compare two different treatment modalities that weren't involved in a head-to-head trial. I think it's especially difficult to do so when the treatment outcomes are a little bit different. I will, without question, agree with her that it appears to me, looking at the data, that it certainly looks like response rates are better than most of the medication response rates we see. And this device seems to have always compared very favorably to medication, even when you take out the dropout, even not even including the dropout rates that occur with medication long term, which are very high, and the side effects that occur with medication, which can be significant. And so my sense is that this therapy falls, in terms of its effectiveness, falls somewhere in between medications, and near, certainly in the range of those more invasive therapies. But I think what's really important too is that where we use this therapy, because traditionally, when we talk about botulinum toxin, when we talk about neuromodulation systems, we are reserving those therapies for the sickest of the sick patients. So when you're only treating patients who have failed more conservative therapies, including medication as a more conservative therapy, that's one efficacy rate. But of course, with this therapy, it's something that you could envision using much earlier in the pathway. And so you don't necessarily have to only treat those patients who have not gotten better with anything else, simply because you have a decrease in cost, a decrease in side effects, a decrease in invasiveness. And so you may be able to use this earlier on in the pathway and end up getting really, really high efficacy rates, because you're simply able to take care of patients earlier on in the pathway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll wrap up quickly, and we really appreciate sort of both of your time. We do have one last question, so somebody just wanted to reiterate that the reimbursement process is ongoing right now, and so we can't talk about any of the pricing, but yes, confirming
No,
that is ongoing.
right, but I see the question, and I
Okay.
realize I neglected to answer that completely earlier. So first of all, when you talk about a DME product, which is used in the home, we have to think about how is the physician compensated and how are we paid for the product. So all of the reimbursement from a physician standpoint is in place. And there are procedural steps and a workflow in the office that the physician or a mid-level can follow, and we're utilizing existing CPT codes for that, including remote monitoring. There's the ability for the physician to look at the data for their patients and then proactively reach out to the patient. So there's actually that's all covered and set. In terms of current reimbursement for the product, we do have reimbursement from VA. We have reimbursement from a handful of commercial payers right now. So that's why if somebody's interested in using the product, we will run any prescriptions through insurance, and we are getting coverage on some of them. But it is a growing process. So it's not no reimbursement, it's a building process, and we're well on our way there. So thank you for the question.
So we're really thrilled to have all of you join us, and we appreciate it. And we'll let Jill and Dr. Colin Goudelocke go. Thank you so much for the incredibly informative webinar and educating us all on this incredibly prevalent disease. For those of you who'd like to learn a little bit more about